voice.
Okie doke. Right. I didn't know that. That's a good point, actually. Okay.
It's your microphone.
What's wrong with my microphone?
It's been up your arse. Don't do it. Come on. Focus. Let's focus and waffle about some legislation. Anyway, right. Okay. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another E5 podcast. Today's one is quite something unique and different because it's going to be led by Mr. Hench himself, Ryan Dempsey. Ryan, do you want to tell us what we're doing on this podcast today?
Yeah, so there's a lot of talk going on around social media at the moment in regards to new legislation around private rented sector. Specifically, a lot of people are talking about the frequency of checks that should be carried out, but there are other things that people aren't really considering that we'll run through what was discussed in the meetings before this came about, and we'll just talk about the other things that this group's talking about rather than just the electrical safety checks.
Okay, so who else have we got with us today talking about the adventure in social housing? Guys, introduce yourself, hiding in the background.
Dan Jackson here. How you doing?
It's Tansy Engineer. Who else have we got?
Hello, listeners. It's Dave, Spark Ninja.
Oh, wow. That's a very polite voice you've got there.
Thank you.
Right, Dempsey, go for it. No holds barred.
So you just said something that we need to not say about 2 minutes ago. This isn't social housing. We are not talking about social housing. We are talking about private rented properties.
Sorry.
And it's an easy mistake to make. And it's probably a deliberate mistake that the committees have made to try and force the private renting sector in with the intent to driving that into the social housing sector. Let it be. If it makes things safer and it saves one person's life, I'm all for it. I'd just like them to do it a little bit better, be a little bit more transparent. So to give you a little bit of history as to kind of understand why the two are different is probably best way to start. And then at that point, we'll just ditch social housing and we'll talk specifically about rented accommodation. So do any of you own a property?
Yeah.
That you rent to people?
Yes, yeah. I do. I have that, yes.
We've got two people who do. So do you have an executive team, a board of directors, trustees, compliance managers, finance managers, surveyors, contractors? Do you procure the work that carries out in your private?
I do have property? A board of directors, chief executive officer, CFO.
Talking about other people other than you.
No. It's my missus. She is the all-knowing, all-seeing board of direction in my household.
Good,
my beloved.
That is good to hear. The point I'm trying to make is you will manage that property reactively. When a tenant calls you up and says something happens, you will go and fix it, or you might not fix it. Whereas in social housing, you have all of those different job titles. You have asset management, databases, software, predictive, analytics. The two are completely different. So when you start seeing that social housing is dangerous, you don't put private renting in the same scope as
am I correct, Ryan, in assuming that with social housing we look at the SARS code of practice as a huge management structure that guarantees or tries to guarantee the safety of the dwellings, but what we're really focusing on here with this PRS is kind of like the rogue landlord things you'll see on the programs, where private landlords just neglect the need to maintain a safe property for their tenants. Is it more that we're actually looking for?
It is, yeah. So what's happening here is we are labelling a complete industry. I think it's around about 4.7 million properties in the UK are privately rented, and what we're doing is we've taken a select few, and this has all been born out of white goods within the London area. So when you talk about Electrical Safety First, which is a fantastic charity that works within our industry, and then we have the London Fire Service, which they work closely together to look at some of the issues that are happening in high-rise, in dwellings, in rented properties. And there's been a discussion around how unsafe some properties are some white goods. Whether this was to do with the increase in buying goods from abroad, I don't know where that came from, but that discussion led to the Ministry for Communities and Local Government stepping in and creating a subgroup to talk about the issues. Now, that would have been way back. So if I just check my emails to see when I was invited to that committee, and if I put private rented sector in there, electrical consultation, the first email I have is the 17th of October 2016. That was the first time I attended, or I visited one of the committees and started to talk about whether we need all of the recommendations that I'll walk through in a second within private rented sector. The one meeting I went to, which you'll be happy to know, or not so happy to know, that I wasn't invited back because I was told that I was too honest and that they didn't need people. I can't remember the exact terms, but I was told that I was a little bit angry, so I didn't get invited back.
Were you pumped from the committee?
I was pumped from the private rented sector.
So that's a southern term for everyone listening. Pumped, a la sacked, a la thanked for your service.
However, on a nicer side of things, there were people in that committee who really appreciated my comments, kind of like the Home Office and DCLG, who since then have invited me back to their office multiple times to give them guidance on the documents that the actual committee that pumped me have developed and submitted.
Is that because of your actual experience actually doing the work?
Actual experience of managing actual
Well, that'll get you nowhere in committees.
Yeah. So to give you some kind of generic information, the private renting sector apparently is an important part of the housing market. As I've said, there's 4.7 million households, which equates to around about 20% of the UK domestic properties. Apparently, and this is apparently, tenants in the private renting sector face a higher risk of electrical shock and fires caused by electrical faults in their homes than those in social housing associations. That's actually in the consultation document. As part of the committee, the reason why I was pumped, which is probably everybody's interested, everybody likes a little bit of drama, I stood up and started talking about the frequency of electrical checks, and they said we should have them as a mandatory 5 years. And I said they are already 5 years for houses of multiple occupation. And I says, why would you put it at 5 years when we should be relying on the engineer's judgment to determine any deterioration, how it's used, where it's used, the external influences, and that frequency shouldn't be given as a standard. We should be relying on the competence of the people in the property to determine when we should next go into the property. I wasn't seeing extend it to 10 years. It could have been 1 year. It could be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years. An individual who's quite high up in the fire service turned to me in front of the 20 people in the room and said, listen, son, until you have seen the result of children cowering under beds in fires, you don't have a say in this matter. Rightly or wrongly, I said to him, well, I have. I used to be a police officer. I've seen that kind of stuff. And the one that you're talking about, did they die in an electrical fire? And yes, it was a little bit, probably shouldn't have said it in front of everybody, but I just got my back. He got my back up because he was trying to belittle me by being all high and mighty. So yeah, I wasn't invited back to that. So anyway, the recommendations from that committee, there were 8 recommendations that came from that. The first, we'll walk through them and we'll talk about each one. The first one was 5 yearly mandatory electrical installation checks should be set out in secondary legislation. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Does anybody? So let's pick just that sentence a bit. So electrical installation checks should be. So it's not a periodic inspection. Exactly.
What's a check?
What is a check? So
is that flicking a switch on and off on a socket and going, yeah, it works?
Listen, because I have come here prepared.
Oh dear.
The committee who has defined this and put these recommendations into DCLG, now MHCLG, have created a new document. And this document is called How to Let. And this document will be published after everything's been put in. And option 1 is to call this new check a landlord electrical installation safety record, kind of like the gas safety record, the landlord's gas safety record. Option B would be to use the existing EICR as a report for landlords and tenants and additional documentations where remedial work is undertaken.
Does it state what this check includes?
Let's have a look.
Is it just basically a visual?
Like
it could be a walk round.
You must provide a gas safety certificate at the start of your tenancy within 28 days of the plan. Electrical installation and fixed appliances must be safe. It is recommended that checks are carried out at least every 5 years. For HMOs, it is mandatory to carry out checks every 5 years. I'm just trying to find the document because I have actually got an example of a landlord's electrical thingy-me-bobby-me thing.
So, Ryan, while you're doing that, I've just typed in the word check into a word search in the new 2020 Electrical Safety Standards in Private Rented Sector legislation.
Yeah.
It's not mentioned once.
Okay.
Just a quick word search. It doesn't even mention the word check.
I suppose they have a much more clever word for check.
Yeah, I'm looking now to see what it says. In fact, it says duties of private landlords in relation to electrical installation, Part 2. A private landlord who grants or intends a specific tenancy must ensure the electrical safety standards are met during any period when the residential premises are occupied under tenancy. B, ensure every electrical installation in the residential premises is inspected and tested at regular intervals by a qualified person, and ensure the first inspection and testing is carried out before the tenancy commences in relation to the new tenancy or by the 1st of April 2021 in relation to an existing specified. Well, that's going to be fun and games. So there's evidently going to be some sort of mad rush up till April 2021 to get anyone who can grab a test kit and push some probes into stuff.
Well, that's it. I mean, is that when you say qualified, is that qualified via a recognised qualification? Or is that qualified by approval of some other third party?
Well, one of the recommendations in the guide was to a private rent sector electrical testing competent person scheme should be set up, which would be separate from existing building regulations competent person schemes.
Yeah, the reason for that is because the competent person schemes that we currently have are all based upon rapid training that only includes initial verification. Competence of periodic inspections in the ICRs hasn't been verified in any of that platform or training route. So the Part P as a register doesn't contain anyone who's competent to do the ICRs, in that it wasn't required to be registered. So that pool of people would be not suitable.
Nice.
Are you speaking, Paul? If you are, we can't hear you, mate.
Sorry about that. I have my mute button on. Does that mean we're potentially going to get a new CPS?
I have not been saying that all this time, honest.
Sounds it. Just quickly though, in the legislation, which is draft, by the way, as we're recording this, the word qualified person is actually under Section 2 interpretation, and it says qualified person in brackets means, drumroll, a person competent, interesting choose a word, to undertake the inspection and testing required under Regulation 3.1, which is the duties of a landlord, and any further investigative or remedial work in accordance with the electrical safety standards. Which safety standards? Also, what are they defining there? A qualified and competent inspection and tester and electrician who can do the remedial work? Or is it a skilled or instructed person who can do the remedial work?
Well, when I looked at
wishy-washy.
11 months ago, I put a video up on my channel which was reading through the logs where all the ministers, all the lords discussed this, and they come up with this term property competent, which indicated that there was a defined level of competency that had to be addressed.
But I have never ever seen the word qualified fit before competent. because we all know that the makeup of what is competent, one of those things is qualification.
Again, if going back to the thing that I read, the ministers, I don't know if it was lords or ministers, it's back on the video, and I read out the chatter between them, and they talked across the room, and they agreed that qualified was competent. And they agreed that across the room, and they were winking at each other. I read all that in the transcript that I read out of on my video.
But did they say here?
I think it was like 8 o'clock or 8:30 at night. They wanted to wrap it and tie up the conversation, get it done. It was like a 20-minute conversation, and they were going across the room about what was requirement, property competent, and then they came up with this qualified is competent. I think that was pretty much the
we're at the
rundown.
mercy of the incompetence of MPs and government.
Yeah.
We're evidently not being advised by anybody on the correct use of the appropriate terminology and hierarchy of known elements of how you build somebody's competence. So these still drafts. So does this mean we can still comment on them? How do you comment on legislation? You can't, can you?
It's magic.
Yeah, okay, fair enough. I'm not going to say any more then.
Yeah. So, just kind of building on what you've just said there, one of the interesting things, I was talking to Dan before we clicked record on this, one of the interesting things that I'm finding is when you look at the Landlord and Tenants Act, which when I stepped away from being a kind of a hands-on Sparky, which surprise, surprise, I once was, I had to learn other documents. I had to teach myself other standards and regulations and acts to kind of do my job as a client managing electrical safety. And one of the things you always found with the older documents like the Landlord and Tenants Act is you could see where they were married to actual legislation like the Electricity at Work. So, for instance, the Landlord and Tenants Act states that every property should be fit for human habitation. It should be free from any risks. It should be, before a tenancy begins, the system should be free from risk, and it should be maintained throughout the tenancy. So you can almost mirror that to Regulation 4, which an electrical system should be designed and erected in a safe manner, and it should be maintained in that safe manner throughout its useful life. So you can see how the older regulations and standards are married together. The problem you've got now is you have what I would term elitists who sit on all of these committees, because if you ever want a laugh and you ever want to kind of tickle yourself, just click on to the EAS specification, the committee, and look at the names. Go to JPEL 64 and look at the names. Go to the private rented sector committee and read the names. And they're all the same people who must buy each other. I bet you there's a secret Santa going on between this committee, this group at Christmas, because they all know each other and they're all in every single. Now, the problem you've got is they are all pals. Yeah. And the problem you've got now is these elitists don't care about legislation that sits at the side of electrical regulations or landlords regulations. So, for instance, just to pick a few out of thin air, you've got your Landlord and Tenants Act 1985. You've got your Housing Act, which includes your Housing Health and Rating System, which is 29 risks, and one of those is electrics. And one of the interesting things about the HHSRS, which is this fit for human habitation, is there are codes. So if a stock condition surveyor goes into a property and says there are 10 C1s, we would think, well, you need to fix them. They're C1s, they're potentially dangerous. No, a C1, a category one in stock condition surveying is completely different to a code one in the electric world.
Yeah.
On the side of that, you've then got the likes of the regulator reform fire safety order, BS 999, blah, blah, blah. You've got building regulations, Part P, Part M, Part L, for energy efficiencies. You've got the Electricity Work Act. You've got Defective Premises Act. So every single property, if you report to your landlord that there's a faulty socket or a faulty, your washer keeps blowing because it's leaking at the back, and you don't fix it, they are liable under the Defective Premises Act, which would fall almost under like the Consumer Protection Act 1987, Plugs and Sockets Regulations 1989, Electrical Safety Continuity Regulations 202. All of these different regulations need to be considered so that when we sit there and see the private renting sector now needs to do A, B, and C, A, B, and C need to somehow be intertwined to all of them that I've just mentioned. Because if they're not, it makes a mockery of what is requirement and what is an elitist kind of pushing from a commercial incentive for their members. That's what it feels like.
I mean, you're right with the names. I mean, I was delving into Health Technical Memorandum 6 this afternoon for a guy who messaged me on Facebook. I saw the document. I went, yeah, this is a blown up document. I wanted more information about IT systems in medical locations group 1. And I saw right at the beginning a list of names. I said, before I even read these names, I'm going to run some names in my head. And I came up with 4 names, and they're all in that document. And those names are in documents about appliances, about completely different areas that aren't related to each other. But the same names go around these documents.
The trouble is, if you write the rules, you can profit from them. Yeah. And that's the problem. I would love, and I've said this before, I would love to see on the JPEL system transparency, and I'd like to see a committee made up of working, practicing electricians who maybe twice a year are asked to sit in a room and are briefed.
It won't work because they'll have to actually work a little bit harder, Paul.
I'm talking about the ones who actually care enough to do it.
Then the ones that are on there right now will be found out straight away.
So
it's the same with like the likes of the in my area of work with training and sitting in guilds and the people who work on their behalf. I see when I work with them face to face, I see nothing but a man that doesn't want to work for a living, just wants to keep his name in the books. That's all I see.
Yeah, I don't get all that. It's just weird, to be honest with you. Two bits of things I want to mention. So years and years ago, when I was on my journey of learning, I did a health and safety course called an IOSH, Managing Safety, and the guy who taught us was a scaffolder. And he walked into the room, and it's a true story, and he basically said, electricity work regulations, yeah, they're a load of bollocks. Provision use of workplace equipment, yeah, they're a load of bollocks. CDM, yeah, that's a load of bollocks. And we were sitting there stunned going, this guy's a lunatic. And he turned around and he said, and the only reason all these exist is because it's already in the Health and Safety at Work Act, but no fucker reads them. So they keep having to produce more and more legislation and more standards to clearly define for the idiots who are just dumbing themselves down by quoting stuff they've never even read. And do you know what? I hate to say it, there is a logic. I mean, if we immediately go to the wiring regulations, Chapter 65, periodic inspection and testing, 651.5, the periodic inspection and testing shall be carried out by one or more skilled persons competent in such work. The wiring regs only ever mentions the word competent when it comes to inspection and testing. But yet in this legislation, law above, it says qualified. But in all other hierarchy legislation, EAWR only has competent in it as Regulation 16, competent for the task. So they're almost reversed. It's a bit weird. I just find it weird the way this is worded.
Mm-hmm.
It's a bit dumb. Some background noise there. Don't know what that is. Is anyone in Tesco's, by the way? Because I can hear this bleeping like somebody's scanning stuff for a checkout. Am I going mad?
No, it's me. You're just gonna have to. Everybody's just gonna have to deal with it because it's Blaine, who's asleep. Who sounds like he's probably just woke up. So
is it your monitor?
It is a monitor that is beeping, and I'm afraid it's the beep.
Of course it is. Kiddies, yes, absolutely.
He tells me that he's breathing. So
no, that's very important.
No, turn it off, Ryan. It's annoying.
Turn it off. Just turn it off.
So this is a weird one as well. In the interpretation of these regulations, they've actually quoted BS 7671, but they've quoted the actual version, 2018. So they've actually quoted the 18th edition. So how's that going to work when the 19th comes out in 10 years?
Well, it just means it's been pushed ahead. You know, whoever's done it has had that agenda on mind to come in to bring that regulation, that requirement of a person to be competent, and they've forced it through. And whoever's obviously it has ignored the fact that it's a document that will move on.
If you don't mind me saying, but anyone who ever looks at any of these laws, which, okay, is probably, I'm in a small circle of a few people here, but they never quote the British standards in laws. They never quote British standards.
This just brings you back to... So I was, like I said, I was sat on the committee talking about this. So I have the minutes from the conversations that were had. And one of the things that we have to kind of look at is none of the, whereas you've just read out there, a mention of electrical inspection and test, that was never discussed in the committees. What was discussed in the committees was electrical safety checks. So from electrical safety check to now inspection and test in accordance with BS 7671, the 18th edition, the government recommendation, who's changed that? Why is it now more?
There's obviously an interpretation. I think the interpretation has been done because there was some suggestion that landlords can do some of this. They weren't wanting to drive it initially to force electricians into this work. They wanted to allow landlords the freedom to do checks by themselves.
Okay.
I think that's one of the reasons why the wording has had to change. Because if they said that it had to be if it was worded to say that it has to be something that is of an existing industrial process, then it'll have to be worked on. But I think that's probably the reason. I did see it again back in the video that I did. I kind of highlighted it. There was a recommendation that landlords can do this check, and that's why they've got to call it a check.
So, okay, Dave. So I'm a landlord. I'm quite a nice landlord, actually. I think I am. But so I wired my previous home. It's all, RCBOs, funny enough, Type A in the early days, because MK used to make Type A RCBOs for anybody else. But yeah, so I've got Type A RCBOs in my house. So I can technically, because I'm qualified, go and do a check on my own home.
They can. And what the government have done, I think Ryan's read from it, they're going to publish a guidance document which is going to give landlords information. Recommendation of RCDs is going to be in there. So it's going to be a guidance document they will publish that will give landlords the tools to carry out their own checking. But then if they don't want to do that, then it's going to obviously be a requirement for a competent person to do the work, third party, and that's going to have to be someone who's authorized, which is where they're now talking about the idea of a separate register of persons.
Can you see this pushing? This is for both you guys now. Can you see this pushing AFDDs when the guidance comes out?
I think
I can see a guidance note pushing for everything reasonably practicable.
Yeah,
pushing AFDD. I can see this pushing. If they're going to write a guidance note for this, well, there is a potential they could write a guidance note with AFDD in. What do you think, Dempsey? Do you think that this guidance for this legislation could possibly introduce a subliminal AFDD nod?
The skeptic in me makes me believe that these committees and the people who sit on there are all working together. So why wouldn't they promote their friends' products? Or those who support them's products.
In fairness, do you know what? I haven't got a problem with AFDD. I know it sounds really weird, but I haven't got a problem with AFDDs being pushed now that we know they work in the domestic environment. My biggest problem is if they are pushed and then following that push and then becoming the norm for people to select and erect with, there is an immediate break. The term electrician is now no more, and there's a immediate race to de-skill and modularize the industry, because we end up going where Europe is. And I've just been in Italy last week. I can tell you now, their installations are utter lash-ups. Their boards are horrendous. We have all this stuff going, we're harmonised with Europe. And yet you go to an Italian board, 4 or 5 different makes of breakers, DC in the boards, AC type RCDs, no selectivity. It's insane. Sorry,
I was in Sweden last week. Same thing, exactly.
Europe are not following all the harmonised stuff that we're being told to follow, like it's doctrine, and yet the Europeans couldn't give a toss. It won't matter at the end of the month anyway. We'll be out of Europe. No, I'm only joking. It will matter because the BSR ignored that result.
But in terms of this legislation, when the recommendations came out, they recommended that the legislation form part of it's called secondary legislation. Does everybody know what secondary legislation is?
Yes.
Yeah. So one of our biggest concerns we'll go into it, but one of our biggest concerns from a secondary legislation perspective is where I once worked for a local authority, and I wasn't responsible for the building control. I wasn't responsible for that part that would monitor and enforce legislation as per. But what I did know is that people in local authorities were being told to scrimp and scrape more and more money. We're being told to reduce our budgets, do less and achieve more. And yet we bring this legislation into 4.7 million properties across the country who will be managed, who will all fall within a local authority jurisdiction, and we are required for them to monitor and enforce that. But yet we don't monitor and enforce Part P. and that needs to go through local authorities. A local authority is responsible. There isn't any enforcing body that is there to. My personal feelings on this is I think it is a good thing. I think testing installations, I don't test mine and I probably should, but I think testing private rented properties, because I have seen some shocking ones, it can't be anything but a good thing. But it's an absolute waste of time making it legislation unless you put somebody there to physically monitor and enforce it. You might as well go onto one of those websites and find one of those stupid laws that state you can't fire a bow and arrow on the steps of the town hall in London on a Sunday afternoon. It's the same.
No, Saturday nights normally now.
Yeah, this was a lot of electricians on social media's problem with this, and comparing it to Part P. You can have something written down all you like, doesn't mean it means anything. You know, realistically.
I mean, who's going to enforce it? That's the question. Yeah. Who's there to enforce
I think
that?
The strategy is going to be that landlords will be instructed that if they aren't going to carry out the landlord checks themselves using the guidance that's published, they're going to be basically, it's going to be put upon them that they'll have to find a verified inspector. So they're going to have a way to identify verified inspectors.
So can I ask a really, really dumb question here? So I grew up in Tottenham, social housing. My dad was single parent, so we were given, I think in 1982, like the most modern 4-bedroom house in Tottenham, basically, and we never once ever had the electrics checked or tested or looked at all by the council. In fact, the only person to do it was me when I was going to Tottenham College, and I went, "Oh, socket! I've just learnt that. I'll open one up and have a look."
Well,
that was it. We never had anything done whatsoever.
Well, when I was a void supervisor with a local authority, and we'd have to do one with every change of tenancy. Every change of tenancy would be a full EICO, an old periodic inspection test. We'd go in there, we'd have minutes on a ticket, we'd add minutes for any remedials, or getting Mr. Muscle out and wiping down the light switches, that kind of thing. And that was it. Every single void property had to go through a periodic inspection, and that was the way it was done when I was working with a local authority.
It's how it happens now, but one of the interesting things is I'm pretty fortunate now in my position, being able to travel around the country, in the sense that I meet a lot of people. So tomorrow I'm heading to Basingstoke to do a talk on compliance to 5 authorities, housing associations. I am in a position now where I can tell you fact. There is a handful of local authorities, housing associations in the UK who do not carry out any electrical safety checks whatsoever on any of their properties, and they have thousands. And the reason why they don't do it is because their board of directors and their executive team state there is no legal requirement that can be enforced that tells us we have to spend money on that.
In the private renting sector,
Wow.
which I've come across with agents time and time again, is when you suggest the electrics need to be checked or make a suggestion, they come back with saying there's no legal requirement for an EICR, and I'm like, yeah, that's right, but there is a legal requirement to make sure the electrics are safe and suitable before the tenancy and throughout the tenancy. And I'm like, well, how do you do that? And they just go, "Ugh."
How do you do that?
Well, this is it, isn't it? I mean, I'm a landlord, so I done electrical installation condition report. Well, I had somebody do it for me. It wasn't me who done it on my property. And every year I have an electrician go in who does the fire alarm, checks the fire alarms, and also he does visual on the electrics, and he does some testing, not a full EICR once a year, but he does some tests to compare. Obviously that costs me. But for me as a landlord, I want to make sure things are safe, because things can go wrong with the electrics. You just don't know.
See, as a landlord myself, I make sure I go around to my tenants every 6 months. And when I'm there, I will check the fire alarms, have a look at the board, and also I'll push the button on the fire alarms because they're interlinked with the CO detectors as well. Really annoys them, but I just do it because I'm the landlord, and then I normally have to say, can you just run a hoover over that and make sure there's no dust on it and stuff. And
yeah, but we hear
about
these guys that have these landlord clients that want 8 properties a day drilled through, where they've been told there's a requirement, but they don't want to commit to the requirements. They try to source out the I don't want to call them electricians, but the guys with authorization by the industry that we work in to blitz these properties just to get the paperwork pushed across. So the legislation itself isn't going to improve that culture with the way it's being pushed through. It might, if anything, kind of spread that culture.
Is that private sector though, Dave?
Yeah.
So there's pressure on that as well.
Like estate agents as well. I used to work when I worked in Ascot. I remember an estate agent over the road. He asked me to do like 4 or 5 in a day. It was all private. It wasn't a local authority. It wasn't social housing.
Yeah.
It was all just because some estate agents obviously manage tenancies on behalf of private landlords.
Yeah.
So they're kind of in the middle. They're like state management bits, and their job is to do all the things on behalf of the landlords. And so they'll develop contracts and they'll negotiate contracts with and get try and make as much out they can of it and squeeze the money.
I think private landlords, I think a lot of them really, unless it is like a proper business where they've got multiple properties and they treat it as a business. I think what landlords forget is that it is a business. If you've got one property, it's a business. It's treated, you're making money, and a lot of people don't actually meet their duties as run it as a business. So I'm a tenant, and trying to get the landlord to get a plumber out because the toilet just keeps flowing and flowing, which could lead to problems, and the electrics, it's just seen as a nuisance to spend 60, 70 quid on a call out. Because for them, it's they just think, oh well, that's it's not my home, and they haven't. A lot of them don't have the money. They don't have the capital.
Mm.
So it's just interesting that when you were I can hear myself echoing somewhere on one of yours. Interesting. I can't anymore. Yeah. Something that's really interesting that I'm kind of reading through the standard now and kind of just trying to understand it a little bit more. And it defines the duty under the local authority, the local housing authority, which mentions that they have to serve a remedial notice if it's found that there is an issue. One of the interesting things is when I look at the attendees for the committee who defined all of this, I was the only one who attended from a local authority.
Jesus.
There was somebody from the local area building control, but that's not the local authority.
I remember back at Part P where we were talking to the government and Clive Betts and all that. There was a guy from building control there. He was completely clueless with regards to how the industry works. He was completely disconnected from how the industry behaves.
The more and more I read, and I think what we'll do is we can share a link to this so that people can read it. The more and more I read of this, the more and more I just realise it's an absolute waste of time. And let me just clarify that when I say it's a waste of time, I don't mean it's a waste of time, the intent of the people who've written this. The intent, hopefully, if not a tiny, tiny bit, the intent is to try and make property safer for people to live in. Now, yes. I think I am, and you guys are, and the whole of E5 and the whole community that we talk to, we're all fully supportive of that. What we're not supportive of is the lack of transparency around this and the lack of who's going to manage this, who's going to monitor this. Now, let's predict it. We're sitting here doing a podcast about the private renting sector. We've got the standard in front of us. We've got the committees. We've got all the minutes. We've even got a letter from the IET from one of their senior directors who attended in my place. The second time I was told I wasn't going, I actually invited her and she took my seat in the committee, and she sat down and backed the comment that I made that we should be spending more time on qualified and competent engineers to make engineering judgment on the frequency of an electrical inspection rather than just picking a date out of fresh air and saying that's the frequency now. I've got that letter that she sent to that committee. So we're pretty well informed as we sit here. But let's predict something. We've got the NIC, we've got NAPIT, we've got the EAS Specification Committee, who are all the people who sit on this committee and who sit on GPL 64. The Electrical Safety Roundtable, which I sit on, the main one. Paul, do you sit on the main one as well? I'm sure you sit on the main one.
No, my one's only just been started up.
Okay.
A long way to go before we get promoted into the big leagues, mate.
So there's a meeting on the 4th of March, which I'm part of. The compliance workbook sits on the main Electrical Safety Roundtable, and the purpose of that is, one, I have to give an update on the social housing roundtable, what we're doing with that. But the key agenda item within that is to talk about next steps for the private rented sector. Now, here's my guess without having any information. NAPIT, NIC, EIC, Alexa, she's actually just lit up blue, so she's expecting me to say something to her. ECA, GIB, all of these firms. There she is. All of these firms. Yeah, he's in my ear. All of these firms in the electrical industry are just about to come up with a new scheme, or my guess would be there is going to be an add-on to your current scheme. Whereas if I'm going to become a member of NIC, EIC, I am assessed against my competence and what I do day to day. And if I say, can you add pat tested to that? They say, yeah, can you tell me how you test the fuse? Can you tell me how you do this? Oh, I'm not sure. Well, we're not giving you pat testing. I suspect that this is going to form an additional part of your current UCAS accredited competent person scheme. They won't set up a brand new one.
Will there be an additional fee for the registration and admin?
Absolutely.
I said 11 months ago in my video, I concluded my video with exactly what Ryan has just said. All of the providers will use this as an opportunity, but all of the people currently registered, currently approved to work in the domestic area are all tested and trained to do initial verifications at the most. That's the minimum requirement, to commission their own electrical installations. So now all these people can do that, but they've got to go on a 2391 or 2395, and they've got to have additional registration because that needs additional observation. So an alternative CPS is not a good idea because no one's going to accept that, but there will be additional registrations. We've got NAPIT, which is basically a registration company of registration methods. There's a variety of registration strategies, and we'll have the same with the NIC. It'll be a separate scheme, and that way they'll obviously have to push people to be trained, because everyone in the domestic sector that wants to carry out this work needs to go on the training, and they're going to have individual registration.
So can I turn this to our wonderful...
And that's per person, not company, in my opinion.
Yes, it is.
Can I turn this on to our wonderful Twitter family out in Twitterland? Because obviously we put this on Twitter, and Mr. Daniel Casey, hello Daniel if you're listening, made a very excellent find when he read the draft legislation quicker than us, so it must mean Daniel is sadder than us. So feel free to come on a podcast and read all these documents at speed. He noted that in the legislation it references IEC 60364-8-1, which is the energy efficiency. It's actually on the bottom of page 2, little subnote. It says basically energy efficiency standard available from the IET. Is there any? Did anybody talk about looking at energy efficiency, or is this just a mistake or a precursor for Amendment 2 when they introduced Part 8 and more energy efficiency stuff? Do you think?
They didn't mention anything
mistake,
about. Yes,
or a mistake.
Yeah, the driver of this is safety.
Yeah. So why do they quote a safe energy efficiency standard then? So I would say there's. Oh, hang on a minute. This is going like the wiring rigs, isn't it? Really, with some whopper of mistakes.
It's not the driver of this legislation. The driver of this is improved safety in dwellings, isn't it? So. Yeah. I mean, we know energy efficiency is going to or start to become elaborated on, so it might be they put it in a little bit ahead of the curve.
Just on the Twitter stuff, Chris Ruddock agrees with us. He said he was concerned that 651.5 will be ignored in order to have less experienced persons to do it at minimum wage to maximise profits. Diligent engineers won't be able to compete. The key here is ethics over profit.
I tell you what's going to happen.
Yeah.
You've got the 2391, 2395, they're still hard to do. So we're going to have new domestic versions created, mapped for that.
Yeah, we are.
Oh my God, you're joking.
100%. That is exactly what's going to happen. Because, yeah, absolutely. Because there is no qualification now that teaches you about cable ages, historical things that you're going to find. 2.5 with 1 mil earth.
I mean, your argument about cables in the loft and cables under thermal insulation, and same thing. It's all justifiable.
So, just again going back to the Twitter comments, because this actually got a fantastic debate going. Damien Evans, hello Damien. He thinks the legislation is a good start, but it needs policing and checking that the person is appropriately qualified. Are we going to have a minimum number of reports completed in a day, fixed, or minimum costs? Adrian Davey thinks none of it will happen, but Adrian Davey, I think, is blocked by half of Twitter. Hello, Adrian. Sir On thinks it's a good idea. DCI Net James. By the time the letting agent has added 20 to 30%, 20% to the government VAT, won't be any money to do a decent job. Race to the bottom. Letting agents looking at £220 for a 5-bed house. Sod that. Equals 123 quid to 220 is a try-on price, and that will probably come down. Gary thinks it should all link back to GIB rates. Some people think it's a real mixed bag. Some positive stuff, some bad stuff.
It's, again, if it drives through and it's forced and it has to be done, they're going to do like with meter installers. They'll create a defined niche, and there'll be a lot of underskilled people trained up to do that work, which we won't have authorization to do.
Here's one. Jordan from Artisan Electrics. I love this comment. Wow, that's great news. This will create some genuine work for us, but also create pressure in the race to the bottom for landlords who just want a piece of paper. Yeah, I think that's everybody's fear, isn't it?
Okay, so let me just hold on to one of those comments. Landlords who require a piece of paper, right? Right now, anybody who goes out and gets an electrician to test their installation because of this legislation is probably already doing a fantastic job to manage the electrical safety in their property. For the people who aren't, which are why this has been created, this will make no difference. They will still not have their properties tested, and they still won't give two flying fucks about whether or not a local authority can issue a remedial notice or enforce anything. This is a complete waste of time.
With the way the industry is, I believe you.
Yeah.
We are punishing the people who are doing it right, expecting a result when we should really be taking a few steps back and enforcing a different way, enforcing what we currently have rather than creating something different and new.
So how do we do that?
Government, it goes all the way up to government, Dan. You need to find additional funds to put into the pockets of local authorities, because local authorities are gradually being asked to monitor more Part P, energy efficiency, secondary legislation. This
goes back to when we consulted about Part P not working before. We come up with alternatives. One of the questions that the government would say is, who's paying for that? And if we put pressure on existing, that's always the question: who's paying for? And that's why a lot of this power and a lot of this authority just goes to those who are already of infrastructure to take on that burden, and they'll make money out of that in ways that we've just mentioned. That's the problem. Who pays for it? That's what the government will ask. The government will want to pay for it.
Government never do. They just devolve everything down to local authorities.
Yeah.
Well, they use it on a percentage. The government do the same as what insurance companies do. So they take the collective potential and put a money value against it. So if we've got 24 million properties and 100 of those burn down, and the cost of those 100 properties to burn down is £1 million, they look at that as is 24 million properties, £1 million, 24 million, blah blah blah. They then work that out and say, well, hang on, it's probably cheaper for us to just keep paying for the properties that burn down than it is to create something new and teams in it. That's what insurance companies do.
Yeah. It's true. It's true. Life, sadly, always has a monetary value, and it's only when that becomes high risk does it actually get prevalence. And I think that's the big difference between the gas and the electrical industry, isn't it? Unfortunately, gas has had far more high-profile deaths, and it's far more of an because a lot of people go, why isn't the electrical industry regulated gas? Because gas will blow up and blow buildings to pieces. It's a pressurized bomb. It's a pressurized gas. Electricity, if it goes bang, yes, it will hurt. It will kill someone. But in proportion, you can have a small pensioner's building blown apart by gas. If electricity goes bang, it will cause a bit of soot in a socket.
Yeah, but one of the interesting things is because some of my friends are firefighters, and I was talking to them about electrical safety and deaths that happen in properties. And did you know that if a property sets fire and somebody dies in it,
yep,
and after
I know
the
what you're going to say.
investigation,
I know what
after
you're
the
going to say,
investigation, they can't determine the cause of the fire. They put it
Can't
down
be
as an
reported.
electrical fault.
Fuck
They
off.
put it down as an electrical fault fire.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that okay. Well, those statistics are wonderfully accurate, then, aren't they?
They
Right.
and if the person is rescued from a property alive from
Yeah.
smoke inhalation from an electrical fault fire,
Yeah.
they are taken out of the property and taken to hospital.
Yeah.
And die in hospital.
Yeah.
It is not reported as a death in a property. It's not. They're not registered against the death because of an electrical fault fire.
Do you know what? I used to, I'm sure Dan probably has as well. When you start researching fire statistics, Dan, you go down a rabbit hole you never want to go down, because every different brigade records stuff in a different context. And when you look at national statistics, you immediately go, I feel sorry for whatever analyst was genius enough to mop all of this together, because I don't really have much faith in it, to be honest, because I looked at Essex and London, and I was trying to look at electrical fires and root causes, and they were all different, all recorded in a different way. It's madness. It's absolute madness.
I mean, my old man Snold, he's a former station commander. Yeah, and he's always talked to me about different cases and examples, and he's tried to, challenge things. And it's the same. If you plug in too much stuff in your, you put in a 4-gang extension, you plug too much in, it overloads, creates a fire. They won't report it necessarily as misuse of the system in that case either. So Dave, it's not exactly reported. The accuracy is very, very poor.
Dave, we need your dad on this. Do you want to share?
Yeah.
I think that sounds like an excuse for a podcast with Dan's the engineer and Dave's the fireman's son.
So, just as you were talking there, I agree. We need to get Master Ninja in on this. I just read recommendation number 7 from the Private Rented Sector Committee. Now, remember right at the beginning, I said that this committee is made up of all the people and some more who sit on the EAS specification. Now, the EAS specification is the Electrotechnical Assessment Specification Committee. These are the people who define the rules and regulations for the UCAS accredited competent person schemes. What is a level 3? How often should they be assessed? Oh, by the way, it's the competent persons that define the requirements of the competent person schemes. That's who sit on it. Okay? So recommendation 7 from this committee, which is made up of multiple people from the EAS committee, states, and this is verbatim, MHCLG should commission the Electrotechnical Assessment Specification EAS Management Committee to consider the most effective method of recognizing competent PRS testers to carry out electrical inspections and tests.
This goes back to that property competent nonsense, doesn't it? Finding specific competence.
So you shall give us work to do, and it's just so incestuous, it's mind-blowing.
Oh, God.
It would be really nice if somebody said an independent body should be set up, independent from EAS and all other bodies, made up of relevant experts and industry practitioners, who will define. They're just, you know what? They're not only writing their own homework, but they're marking their own goddamn homework as well. And this is the trouble. This is why I don't have faith. I'm sorry to say this, and I'll say it publicly. I don't have faith in these semi-professional committee goers.
No,
they're insane. If you go to a committee, go there because you feel like you can make a difference or have a presence and inform something that makes people's lives better or improves the industry.
I
Not
would
just sit there to
personally
say,
yeah,
"Oh, I've got it on my CV."
I would like people to do that, but personally, you guys know, the last 2 or 3 years, I have tried tirelessly to get on every single one of the committees that help define electrical safety in our industry, and
Yep.
I have been chastised, character
Well, you have
assassinated,
been you've been blacklisted and character assassinated because you have experience and you're too honest.
That's the killer thing. I'm too honest, and surely that's not a bad thing. That shouldn't be a bad thing.
Well, no, given the fact that half these people are supposed to be professionally registered and adhere to numerous codes of conduct, they should be completely aligned and respectful of all your views, because your views are always backed up with facts and evidence, which the industry, it seems to chafe their crotch over the last few years when you have talked. So
I agree.
Yeah,
it's so I'm going to take a step back when we talk about getting people onto committees and stuff, because my experience is you lot can go on and try it. I've tried, I've failed. I'll stick with E5, and if there's anything that we can do as E5, if we could, if the UK government was listening to this, and the colleagues and the people who invite me down to the Home Office regularly to sit and talk about the electrical industry and pick my brains on the things that happen, if they're listening to this now, I would state, why don't you let members of E5 independently go into these committees and give you a review on what they believe is right and what they believe could improve. I'm not saying it's wrong, what could improve, and I guarantee that will never happen.
No.
I don't doubt you, to be honest with you. It would be nice if, because I think we've got to that point where our knowledge of the industry and our understanding of the industry is such that you can see the industry is so incestuous. They can't. They're marking their own homework so much. They don't know what new is. They don't know what different is. They don't know how to change it. To be honest with you, they can't see the woods for the trees, and that's genuinely one of the things. I mean, 4 years ago, I stood in front of the IET and said, "You have done nothing for electricians since 2007. Nothing." Now they're doing something, but they were doing nothing. They didn't know how to talk to them. They didn't know how to understand them. They didn't know the language of electricians. They just couldn't engage on their level at all. And I think the industry, it's not just the IET. I think it's lots of, well, the majority of the leadership of our industry are struggling with engaging with the sparks.
We don't seem to be having a problem with that.
No, because we can tone our language any way we want. And I've always said that an electrician, the role of electrician is a vocation, not a profession. And there is a hell of a difference between a vocation and a profession. And yet the institutes and the companies act professionally, but they don't have an idea how to speak to a trade or a vocation. They just don't. They don't. It's different.
More importantly, they don't know where or how to listen.
Yeah, it's true.
You know, they're not on the platforms. You look at the platforms that we're on, the people who actually are from those organizations is the marketing person or some other person. And whenever someone else from those or from those committees comes in, it's very snidey and it's just not, it doesn't work. You know, it just doesn't work. And they don't know how to speak to their own trade that they represent and apparently caretake.
I have said that to many of the industry organisations. You cannot speak to sparks anymore. You do not know, forgive my crack, you do not know the language of the hairy ass spark. That's a southern term, but it's goddamn true. We have our own ways. Dan knows that there's a language for people who work in domestics. There's a language for people who work in industrial, commercial jobs. There is genuinely different approaches, behaviours, attitudes, almost trade slang, isn't there, to a certain extent, Dan?
Plus, you've got to combine contractual pressures with guys actually trying to work and earn a living. You know, working like 12 hours on, 12 hours on, all that nonsense as well needs to be considered. You know.
So if we could summarise this then, because we're going on a bit, what do we? If I go around to each of you now, me personally, I'm 50-50 on this. I don't know where it's going. I think it's being pushed heavily. I think yes, testing in housing is good regardless whether it's private or your own. I think people should just pay more attention to it. I think for electricians, it's easy for us because if Dan needs to check his wiring, he's just going to check his wiring. He knows what to look for. We all do. So we take it. We're probably the worst offenders, to be honest with you. Although hopefully when we are doing the electrics, we do it so thoroughly because we don't want any of our mates tearing us to pieces. But what do you guys think? Start with Ryan. We'll go round. Ryan, what do you think? Good, bad, indifferent?
I think we do need to do more to test private rented properties, the ones that are bad. We do need to find some kind of legislation that can be enforced to improve the lives of people who can't speak up, who are living in these properties and don't have anywhere else to go. Deep down, I believe that the people who've sat on these committees and the people who we've given a little bit of a hard time, I don't think they are intentionally doing this to be arseholes. I think they probably believe that they're trying to achieve electrical safety. I think it's a good thing, but I don't think it will make any difference.
Okay, Dan?
I think that it is fundamentally flawed, but it will improve some electrical systems in properties. Going back on what Ryan said earlier, yeah, the people who don't want to get this done, they won't do it. They won't be found. They won't care, and that will continue. But some agents will put pressure on landlords, and that's a good thing, in my opinion. It will create work for electricians, which is a good thing if it's being done properly. But again, we're going to have, well, we know we've gone through this so many times in other podcasts. There's so many electrical companies or individuals out there that aren't competent at what they do, and they, ultimately it's a false economy in some respects to some people who have work done. But I think it's better than not having it at all, ultimately.
Okay, Dave?
The industry's too fucked for this to work.
And there, I think on that bombshell, with that clinical, do you know what? I could polish that, but Dave just says, mate, poetry.
I could speak for 20 minutes, but I'd say that for 20 minutes.
It's too fucked for it to work. God
Training,
bless you,
registration, scheme providers, blah 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 blah.
And that is, I'll be honest, I think that's a perfect statement to end this podcast on. So, just for those listening, thank you very much for listening. There will be more podcasts coming with more co-hosts. Hopefully, we will have more of Richard Emery. We'll have Lee Wards. We'll have lots and lots of our social media friends on here talking about the issues that matter to us and hopefully the wider industry. And until next time, thank you very much, chaps.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for your time, guys.
And take care of yourself and each other. See you on the next one. Bye.